The Three Feathers. Chapter 1. Dreams. Once upon a time, there was a young rooster who lived on a farm on the eastern shore, somewhere between the tundra-like highlands to the south and the lush, low grasslands of the north. His name was Joshua Along. Joshua led a comfortable life, watching over the hens in his coop, protecting them from predators, and announcing each new day at precisely 4:45 a.m. His feathers were red as the sun rising over the mountains, a deep red on top and a more orange color toward his chest. His tail feathers had a bluish hue to it, which gave him the appearance, depending on where the sun hit them, of a tropical bird rather than a rooster. The hens loved him for his striking colors, and Joshua, being a somewhat smart and self-aware bird, knew it and loved every minute of it, basking in the attention. You could see him more often than not walk around inside the pen, his head held high, strutting his stuff among the hens and chicks of his flock. But at night, when all was still, when the busy pecking and roosting and strutting around quieted down, when the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the great lake to the east, Joshua felt a longing inside him. A longing he could neither explain, nor talk about, nor even fully grasp. It was just there whenever the noises of the day ebbed down to stillness, when the rustling and bustling inside the coop stopped, and all was quiet. The longing was like a pull, or perhaps a push at times, from where he did not know. It dawned on him one night, somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m., when all he could hear was the distant waves breaking onto the shore in the moonlit night. It dawned on him that he was looking for something bigger, something wider, something vast, something more than what was in front of him each day and every day after that day. At that moment, when the moon stood high over the darkened hills and the silhouettes of the other chickens in the coop were all black against the window, he decided that he had to go and find whatever it was he was looking for. It all seemed very clear to him. He thought he would just stand on the highest perch inside the pen, spread his wings, and, in a combination of jumping and pushing his wings down hard several times, he would fly out of the pen and land on the other side. From there, he would just walk. But 2 minutes and 12 seconds after he first had the thought of leaving, he became distracted by a noise from outside the coop, and he forgot all about it, and suddenly tired, he fell into a dreamless sleep, from which he woke at 4:45 a.m., like clockwork, to call out the new day. Nothing noteworthy happened over the next few months, at least nothing that was a departure from the daily routine. Joshua had forgotten all about that clear and cloudless night and his decision to begin his journey. But once in a while, sometimes while picking for food or settling a quarrel between some of the hens, or while strutting around in the pen showing off his colors, you could watch him stop suddenly, as if trying to grasp a distant thought, a fleeting feeling, or a trace of memory from somewhere. Then he was gone, and he continued with whatever it was he was doing at that moment, until the dreams began. They were foggy at first, indistinct, and you could barely call them dreams. More like mysterious clouds that were solid only on the edges. But over time, an image carved itself out of the fog like a figure sculpted from clay by invisible hands. Joshua began to see what looked like an immense cave. The massive walls of it extended for miles in all directions, and one could only see the lower parts of them going upward toward the ceiling that was in itself invisible and lay in mystery and nothingness. As he walked all by himself in the vast cave, feeling the ever-changing ground under his talons, from areas of very fine, almost white sand to large plates of flat rock covered with silvery gray moss, he seemed to move toward a certain point far in the distance. Each time he tried to focus on what it was he was looking at, he woke up. Each night he tried anew, and in time he was able to get closer and closer to the shape in the distance. He began to think about the dream during the day, and the hens in the pen began to talk amongst themselves, about his absent-mindedness and his, at times, lack of focus on what he was doing. Once, during an especially vivid dream, he thought he saw a large feather in the distance, but the image faded almost instantly, leaving him wanting it even more. During this time, he started to peck at the other hens more frequently and more harshly than he intended to, not knowing where this sudden increase in frustration came from. His daily tasks meant less and less to him, and the joys he usually experienced during the day faded and were soon exchanged for a sense of hopelessness and despair. "What's the use?" he thought more often than not. The hens swore that the colors of his feather coat became less brilliant during that time, and his proud and at times almost charismatic presence lessened to the point of non-existence. He wanted for the dream to stop. He wanted to just be left alone rather than wander every night endlessly through the vastness of the cave, moving slowly towards something in the distance that seemed to stay out of reach forever. Sometimes during the dream, he thought he should turn around or go in another direction, but there didn't seem to be another place in the tremendous cave that felt like there was something of value except in the one direction he was going toward. At some point, he reached a river. Its slow-flowing water was crystal clear and of deep turquoise. He walked beside it for a while. One night he dreamed that he would just sit down next to it and die right there. Let go of his feathers, his flesh and skin and bones. Let go of his memories and thoughts and all that he was. But as hard as he tried, it didn't work, and even though he felt more dead than alive, he didn't seem to be able to give up completely. And then, one night in deepest winter, after fresh snow had fallen onto the hills above the farm and the land below, and the cold crept into the coop like large tongues of frozen ice, the image in his dream suddenly became clear. He knew it was still a distance away, but he could make out the cave wall more clearly. He saw what he at first thought was just a lighter coloring on the wall. That was actually a smaller cave adjacent to this one, whose ceiling emitted a slight glow, as if there was, behind the thick walls, a massive source of light. As he drew nearer, he saw that the light made the walls nearly transparent, and in looking even closer, Joshua saw small threads going through the transparent, crystalline stone like veins. The steady glow illuminated the cave just enough to see what was inside. When he entered the small cave, small only in relation to the vastness of the larger one, he was stunned by the beauty of the patterns in the walls and ceiling. The vein-like threads were like rivers in the earth observed from high above. There were small indentations of darker color shimmering in shades of blue that looked like large bodies of water, deep crevices changed to mountain ranges, interspersed with green and aventurine patches that looked like pastures. He felt the strange sensation of looking down on an incredibly detailed, magnificent landscape, rather than looking up toward a ceiling of stone. Joshua briefly experienced vertigo until he adjusted to the upside-down view. He had never seen anything like it, and in no imagination or past dream had he ever seen such beauty. And then his gaze followed the turquoise shimmer of what looked like a great river down toward where the ceiling met the floor. There stood a cylindrical stone, deep black and smooth like polished quartz. At its top lay 3 feathers. When he looked at them closely, they seemed to change their colors, first reflecting his own palette and moving through the spectrum of the rainbow from deepest green to yellow and blue. He could not keep his eyes off them. He thought them to be the most precious things in all the universe, and it was then, while he dreamed, that he experienced for the first time what it meant to be fully loved. It overwhelmed him, and he woke. It was still dark in the coop. As he looked at the hens on their perches in front and beside him, the intense feeling of love he had felt in his dream spilled out from him and into the coop, and for an instant longer, Joshua loved all the hens with the same all-encompassing love. He even loved the perches themselves, the walls of the coop, the hay-covered floor, the window, and the night beyond. There was no being that was not enveloped in his love. For a short moment longer, he felt that it encompassed him completely. And then, like a shooting star disappearing in the night sky, the feeling lingered a moment longer and dissipated. It left him empty, cold, and lonelier than he had ever felt before. The warm bodies of the other chickens in the coop could not give him warmth or company or help him close the wound in his soul. He was alone. Okay then, before we start chapter 2, I thought I'll show you a couple of things that for the last year and a half after the Three Feathers was published, some of my friends gave me some things. For example, they gave me this, Diane gave me this Joshua, right? Then Chloe gave me a beautiful mosaic Joshua. Unfortunately, it fell from the nightstand, and the rooster crown has to be reattached. There's no symbolic meaning in that at all. So, anyway, I'm gonna put some crazy glue on that. But that's Joshua with his rooster crown, and there's this little guy, little fellow. It could be Joshua. You know, I don't think he's black and white, but then I got this finger puppet Joshua. Very cute. Could put it on top of a pencil. Then, the crown fell off again. No, Joshua, no. Then, my friend Maxine gave me a candle that has feathers on it. And other friends gave me a book that is called Joshua. So Joshua has made his way into my life already after only a short period of time. And since I wrote the book, I really can say in honesty that my life has changed into a different direction, and the characters of the Three Feathers have stayed with me for some reason. There is not a day that goes by that I don't think about them in one way or the other. So anyway, enough of that. Let's go to chapter number 2. Chapter 2. Death. The days and weeks that followed were nothing but grayness. Gray days, dark nights, and a chill wind from the sea that wouldn't let up. The snow that remained was brown and iced over. The food had a stale taste to it, and while the hens and half-grown chicks were busy scratching the patches of grass and dirt looking for worms, Joshua just glanced at them impatiently, disturbing their peace whenever he could. He was jealous of their content lives. For them, it was all about finding food and water, scratching the soil, and laying eggs. He could not find any satisfaction in it anymore. He was overcome by a sense of restlessness during the day and sleeplessness at night. As much as he wished to go back to the dream, he could not find a way there. It eluded him to the extent that he tried to daydream to bring the images back into his mind, the images of the Three Feathers on the black cylinder of stone. He increasingly saw the coop as a prison rather than a safe haven and a home. He found himself gazing longingly through the fence and toward the world beyond. I need to find them, he thought to himself one day. I have to find them. Joshua could feel the unrest among the hens when he jumped up onto the highest perch of the pen. For a moment, he thought he should just stay with them, protect them, settle their quarrels, and strut his stuff in front of them as he always did. But something inside him knew that he would not be able to do that anymore. And when this something, this force inside him swelled up and grew and became utterly unbearable, he opened his wings and jumped. It took him several flaps to reach the height of the fence. At the last moment, he almost didn't make it, but he pushed and put everything he had into his final flap. Then he was past the fence and landed on the other side. The hens came toward him, wanting to follow him, but couldn't understand that there was now a barrier between them. He was unreachable. He was free. A rush of excitement filled him as he walked away from the fence. One more time he looked back, pushing down the feeling of regret. Then he turned his head and concentrated on the task before him. Joshua didn't have the slightest idea where to go, but he thought that he would cross the large meadow first and find shelter under the trees in the thick woods beyond. The other direction was water, and he did not want to walk along the beach out of fear of being too exposed. As he stood at the edge of the meadow, looking far across to the other side, he suddenly wasn't so sure anymore. Did he really just fly out of the pen and leave his home, the place where he was born and grew up in, the place where he had lived all his life? It seemed silly all of a sudden. Why did he do this? He couldn't find any logical explanation for it. For a moment he was torn. Maybe he should just go back. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. But as he was here now, he thought that he might as well see what's on the other side of the field. He could always come back. And so he began to cross the large meadow. This was much easier said than done. The snow was iced over at points, and large patches of the grass were still frozen and stood out like huge spikes from the ground. After he was halfway across, he realized that the sun was way past the midpoint and that in a few hours it would be dark. He wanted to make it to the edge of the woods before nightfall and find shelter in one of the trees. By now, he was convinced that he would return to his flock the next morning. And then he heard it. It was a low cry, distant at first, but moving closer fast. Joshua dropped to the ground. He realized that his red feathered coat made him visible against the white snow and the green and brown grass. When he saw the owl, its wingspan 3 times his own, her talons double the size of his, and a beak that could break his legs in one bite, he felt as if death itself came for him. He lay frozen on the ground, not breathing and almost trying to make his heart stop out of fear of being detected. When he turned his head slightly, he saw her, gracefully gliding against the sky, circling overhead. He was sure she was about to come for him any second, diving down and grabbing him, lifting him up into the air to take him to a spot where she could start eating him, only to leave the head and feathers behind when she was done. But to his surprise, she didn't come toward him. Instead, he followed her flight path with his eyes until the realization hit him full force. The pen! Now unprotected, the hens had no warning. The owl would have easy prey. She could effortlessly kill 3 or 4 birds before the rest of them would be able to flee under the coop. Joshua had always warned the hens about birds of prey. He had seen the owl several times, way before any of the hens would have been even aware of her. Once he spotted a hawk. When he had seen him approach, not more than a speck of dust before the low sun, he cried out, and the hens jumped under the coop to safety just in time. He knew from the moment he saw the owl's flight path that it would be too late. He cried out as loud as he could and jumped and ran toward the barn. There was no way he would be there in time to warn them. He flew when he could, stumbled several times, and once even crashed headfirst into a snowdrift. Time seemed to thicken like syrup, and Joshua thought it an eternity before he finally reached the pen. What he saw was an image of horror. There were feathers everywhere. 2 hens and a younger chick lay dead on the ground inside the pen. He frantically tried to get inside, but to no avail. There was no jumping off point to get high enough to fly in. He circled the pen, trying to see who was left. He saw some commotion under the coop, but he couldn't see anything under there. I should have stayed, he thought to himself. I should have watched over them. The thoughts had, at first, barely any emotion connected to them. He just very rationally realized his part in the death of his flock. He felt removed from himself, as if outside looking in on the scene in front of him. You left us. One of the hens looked at him from under the coop. You were supposed to protect us, and you left. This is your fault. I'm sorry, Joshua replied. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. A second hen looked at him. What are you still doing here? You left us. Go. Leave. There's no place for you here anymore. And with that, she turned away from him and went back under the coop. The other hen looked at him for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared as well. He stood there, grasping on the periphery that his life, as he had known it until now, was over. I'm sorry about what happened, he thought to himself. I'm so sorry. As if waiting for an answer, he looked at the place where the 2 hens had just stood. Maybe they would come out again, look at him and tell him that it was okay, that it wasn't his fault, and that he could come back into the pen and continue to live with them. But they didn't come. Okay, we are now at chapter 3. Departure. The chill easterly wind from the bay ruffled his feathers. He didn't know why he stayed at the spot where he had spoken to the hens, but he did. It felt hard for him to move. I can just sit here for a while, he thought. See what happens. He sat and watched the coop for any movement from the hens. As the sun began to set over the hills, the lights in the farmhouse came on. Then the door opened and the farmer stepped outside. He came straight toward the pen, not paying any attention to Joshua. When he saw what had happened, the farmer cried out. His face red from anger, he cursed at the sky while he collected the limp bodies of the dead chickens. When he came out of the pen, he went straight toward Joshua. He dropped the chickens to the ground and tried to grab him while still cursing and yelling. The farmer's large, calloused hands almost caught Joshua twice, once grabbing one of his wings. He eluded him, but barely. In the end, the farmer kicked at him until Joshua escaped into a nearby tree. From there, he watched the farmer eventually collecting the dead chickens and walking off toward the house. He stayed all night on his branch, high up in the tree. His dreams were dark and filled with the small and lifeless bodies of his flock. The 2 hens cursed him over and over, their eyes dead and their feathers bloody. Several times he awoke in the dark, wishing himself back inside the soft warmth of the coop and the small rustling sounds and familiar features of the others. He could not yet fully grasp that this part of his life was irrevocably over, gone like fog in summer's sun, erased and not belonging to him any more. At first light, when everything was still, except for the wind in the treetops above, he flew down from his branch and made his way to the meadow. He did not look back. Several times he thought he had to, but he stopped himself each time. The sooner I forget, the better, he told himself. As he began to cross the meadow for the second time, a cold, steady rain set in, soaking his feathers down to his skin. There was no tree to stand under, no bush to find refuge in. The openness of the seemingly endless field was unsettling. Joshua caught himself looking in all directions many times over, spotting creatures where there were only shadows. He saw a fox in the shape of a distant snowdrift, a raccoon in a patch of grass that seemed to move in his direction. His eyes played tricks on him until he thought to himself that there was no use in even thinking this way. If any predator wanted to eat him, there was nothing he could do about it. When he finally reached the trees, he was exhausted, hungry, and needed water badly. His left talon started to hurt him, and he needed a place to rest and eat something really soon. Under a large oak tree, he found a couple of worms who had made their way out of the ground during the rain. A small trickle of a stream provided water. He was hoping to come across a large pine tree to find refuge for the night, but none of the trees had leaves on them. So he spent the night on a slippery branch in the rain, his body close to the stem of the tree for protection from the wind. He did not want to miss his flock, but he did. He missed them all terribly, the ones that were dead, the ones who still lived, and even the hens that had cursed him. The next few days passed in a haze for Joshua as he made his way through the forest. The rain stopped for a while, then continued on and off. The cold was his constant companion, and except for one night, where he slept in the remnants of an old fallen-down barn that smelled like mice and induced the terror of a fox coming for him, he slept in the rain, somewhere high up in a tree, out of reach for at least some of the predators. His thoughts circled around his flock and the horrible mistake he had made in leaving them. There was no place for him to go, and he saw the remainder of his life before him, extending into infinity in an endless spiral of regret. This wasn't what he had in mind. In the evening of the third day, Joshua saw a patch of blue sky through the trees, and as he reached the edge of the forest, he watched the sun set in the eastern sky, flooding the land before him with golden light. But even as he stood there gazing at the horizon and the gloriously beautiful painted sky over the valley, he could not find peace. He was sure it would elude him until he died. Hey there. We are at chapter 4. Oh! Wolf. The next morning, Joshua arose at exactly 4:44 a.m., and without even thinking, he crowed his wake-up call until he realized there was nobody to wake up. He sat on his branch high in the tree and wished himself back into the coop until bits and pieces of last night's dream came back to him, a dream of feathers so fragile that when he touched them they crumpled until what was left of them was only dust. Of the glorious dream he had before he decided to make his journey, only a distorted image stayed with him, not reminiscent of the original powerful vision, but merely an after-image. And he began to question even that. "I'll never make it," he thought to himself. "I'll probably just get lost somewhere in the wilderness until I finally become another meal for a fox." As the light increased, a blanket of thick layered fog appeared, resting in the valley before him. As Joshua followed the fog with his eyes all the way to the other side of the valley, he saw the peak of a high mountain towering above the fog. For the smallest of moments, the shape of the mountain stirred deep inside him the memory of the dream. He thought briefly that he had seen it in his dream somewhere in the cave's ceiling. He knew suddenly and unmistakably where he had to go. His eyes fixed on the snow-covered peak in the distance. Somewhere beneath it lay the 3 feathers waiting for him in the dim shadows of the massive cave. And perhaps his own redemption lay there as well. As he made his way through the fog, going from boulder to boulder for cover and glancing in all directions, he heard a howl in the distance. At first, it was far away, but as he moved, it got closer. Always to his left, it seemed to hold his own speed. When evening came, Joshua took refuge halfway up a large boulder in a small crevice. He could not find sleep that night, and when he did, he dreamed that he stood in front of a black hole, frozen in terror. Red eyes peered at him from within the darkness. He couldn't move, as if his body didn't belong to him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his beak. There was a grey shadow coming toward him with immense speed, and just before it reached him, he awoke. Joshua realized that there probably would not be a moment during this journey when he would be completely safe. The next day the fog was gone, as if it never happened in the first place. Far across the valley, much further than Joshua thought when he saw it first, stood the snow-covered mountain in the distance. Joshua tried to hold it in his line of sight as he navigated his way through the high grass of the frozen fields. Once in a while he fluttered up in the air to get a better look, fully aware that he was exposing himself to everything and everyone around him. When the sun set behind the mountain, he realized that he badly needed water. Maybe it was because he was getting tired from the constant jumping up and hopping through the grass when suddenly, after yet another jump, Joshua landed right in front of a hole in the ground. It didn't register at first, but when he saw the grass around the opening pushed flat into a path leading away from it, he realized in terror that he stood in front of a foxhole. He froze. Unable to move, Joshua stared into the hole. The small feathers around his neck stood up. He thought it a hallucination at first when two red eyes appeared inside the blackness, staring at him. Never had he seen anything more frightening in his life. He was suddenly certain of his death. Slowly the eyes came closer until the fox's head appeared. What occurred next happened so fast he wasn't sure of the exact sequence of it. He heard a sound on his left, like a fast movement through the grass. The fox, low to the ground, came out of his hole and without any warning jumped toward Joshua, who at the same time flew up in the air. He saw the fox land where he had been standing. While in the air, he could see in his peripheral vision a large shadow moving in and hitting the fox like a battering ram. When Joshua landed 2 seconds later, he saw the wolf. Gray, large, and holding the comparably small fox in his mouth. The wolf snarled and snapped the fox's neck in one bite. Joshua, still in absolute terror, thought of a way to escape the wolf and could only hope that the fox was enough food for him for a while. Then the wolf dropped the fox in front of him. They looked at each other for a moment. "I have been tracking you for 2 days." The wolf's thoughts reached Joshua easily. "You should be more careful with your cover. From the air, you must be an easy target, with your red feathers against the grass." Joshua, rather than prolonging this, thought he'd come right out with it. "If you want to eat me, do it now. I'm tired, I need water, and I can't escape you anyway. So, if you wouldn't mind, I'd rather get this over with." Was the wolf smiling? Or was it the thought of a smile that reached Joshua? Either way, it was not at all what he had expected. It was rather unsettling. "I'm not here to eat you." The wolf sat down. Even now, he was at least 3 times Joshua's height. "I'm here to help you." "Excuse me?" Joshua thought. The wolf lay down. "I am here to help you." Preposterous, Joshua thought. "And yet, you are alive and well, and a minute ago, you were as good as dead." Joshua could hardly escape the logic of the wolf's argument. You might keep me alive until after you have eaten the fox," he thought, looking straight at the wolf. "You make very little sense at the moment," the wolf replied. "But you are also probably still scared, so I will not take it personally." "Thank you?" Joshua wasn't sure if he meant this ironically or if he just meant it. He was thankful, no doubt about that. A few moments ago, he was certain of his death. Now he was safe? He couldn't remember when he had felt like this before. There were vague memories of a warm coop and the closeness of the chicks next to him when he was very young. But since he had been an adult, he realized at this moment that he didn't even know how very little he had felt safe. until now. He sat across this scary-looking, blue-eyed, large wolf who could snap his neck without blinking an eye, and he felt safe? Despite the irrationality of this, there was a brief moment when Joshua decided to trust this feeling, to go with it, to embrace it. Trust. Put your life in someone else's hands. Trust. Just before he was about to lose the feeling again, giving way to fear once more, the wolf got up. There's a small creek, mostly underground, but I saw where it reaches the surface for a while. We should be able to make it there before nightfall. And that was that. The wolf moved in front of him, leaving the grass slightly bent and much easier to navigate. Joshua followed. To where? He did not know. First he needed to get water, and then see from there. One talon stride at a time. Gray. Excuse me? My name is Gray, in case you were wondering. Joshua was indeed just wondering what the wolf's name was. He still wasn't used to the instant communication between himself and the wolf. With the hens in his pen, talking to them was less immediate. The barrier between them thicker, as if there was a wall he first had to penetrate. With the wolf, it seemed so clear. At the wolf's suggestion, they were in the process of climbing a rather large hill. Mossy rocks and the long shadows of the dwarf pines gave it an eerie feel. The wolf didn't seem to notice. Nose to the ground, he led the way through the forest, sometimes stopping in his tracks, ears up, and listening intently. Not far from here, on the other side, there's a small cave where we can stay during the night, he thought to Joshua, as the image of a small cave appeared in his mind. It had begun to snow slightly, and Joshua was glad when they reached the small cave. It was little more than an overhang in the rock, but it was large enough for both of them, and there was a small tree growing under it. Joshua jumped up on one of the low branches. I will be right back, the wolf thought. There's a nest of rabbits just below. And he was gone. 5 minutes later he came back with 2 rabbits in his mouth. He entered the cave, lay down, and started to eat them, clearly enjoying himself. Joshua watched from his branch, feeling a bit uneasy. I'll leave some for you if you want. Gray's thoughts reached him. No, thank you. I'm fine. There were rabbits on the farm you lived in? Yes. How do you know? If you don't want everything around you to know what you are thinking, you will need to learn how to guard your thoughts better. I didn't know. I can see what you are thinking very clearly, and the answer is no. I would not eat you even if I were very hungry. I'm glad, Joshua replied, still uneasy about the subject. There were about 24 rabbits, he continued. Every Sunday one was taken. Sometimes I wondered if I would be next. I didn't lay any eggs or have any other important functions to fulfill. You looked out for the hens and chicks. You kept them safe. That's a function. Joshua's gaze grazed the moonlit valley below. His eyes stung suddenly. I guess so. At least until I was silly enough to think I should go and leave and follow a dream. Since then, there has been nothing but misery. The wolf looked at him. His blue eyes seemed to penetrate deep into Joshua's soul. He couldn't look away. He could sense depth in the wolf and wisdom, but behind that he saw sadness also. After a while, an image came to him of a snow-covered forest. There were icicles hanging from large pines, their branches almost touching the ground thick with snow. He saw a female wolf, her front paw in a trap. There was blood all around the large iron claw that had penetrated the wolf's skin and flesh deep into her bone. For 3 days Gray stayed with her, bringing her game for food. But when the hunters came on the 4th day, they came to kill her. Gray fought them and killed one of them before he could raise his bow. The second hunter missed Gray by an inch, but he was a great hunter from the villages by the wind gorges, and his second arrow found the heart of his companion only moments after Gray had evaded the first. He wanted to die right then and there, for his life seemed to have lost all its meaning without her on his side. He wanted to just step into the clearing and let the great hunter's arrow find his heart also. Maybe in death they would find each other again, he thought. But something in him wasn't ready for this yet. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. She wouldn't have wanted this, he realized. Like a warm wind from the highlands, where the winds carry the warmth from the wide, sun-flooded valley up into the hills at night, it softly spoke to him of the life she wanted him to have. So he stayed hidden until the night gave way to dawn, and the hunter was gone, and so was her body. He looked at the area where she had lain for 3 days, but couldn't see any signs of her. The snow had covered everything. The blood and even her scent were gone. It was as if she had never existed. The wolf ran for 10 days, crossing the tundra, barely stopping, barely eating, and barely feeling anything. He had wished that he could just leave his loss and run away from it and never face it again. But it followed him like a hunter stalks his prey, and on the 11th day he slowed down and let his grief catch up with him. He sank to the ground and wept until he fell into a dreamless sleep. And when he woke the next morning, the emptiness in his heart was as vast as the tundra and as cold. "I'm sorry," Joshua thought. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you," the wolf replied. "You did all you could to help her." "I know," Gray thought. "You didn't leave her there, you stayed with her." Joshua was surprised about the bitterness that accompanied his thought. "No, I didn't leave her. That doesn't make me feel less responsible. For it should have been me who died there in the cold, not her. I would have given everything for it to have been me. Everything, and more." There was no answer to that, and Joshua felt the emptiness that enveloped the wolf at that moment, and he realized that this emptiness was in his heart as well.